Well, welcome again this morning as we kick off an extremely important series in My View today. As we kick this off, let's just play a little word association game this morning. If I were to ask you, what is an American? We would all know what that is, right? If I was to ask you, what is a German? We would all be on the same page. We know what that is. What is a Canadian? Well, it's pretty obvious. What is a comedian? Not I this morning, but all of those are pretty clear. But what if I were to ask you, what is a Christian? This morning, it's not as clear. It's not as easy to define. And even further, what comes to your mind when you hear the word Christian? A multitude of things, and depending on who you are this morning, depending on what your experience is, that term could bring up a wide range of emotions. Some of you hear the term and you're like, yeah, it's very positive. That's me. I am a Christian. Some of you hear that term and it's not as positive as it is for others today. You know, if somebody were to ask you today, are you a Christian? Would you straight up say yes? Or would you say, yeah, but? You know, yes, but I'm not one of those. Yeah, but I'm not like that. Or would you just say, well, let's clarify that. What do you mean by Christian? Some of you might just flat out say, no, I am not, because of all the different connotations that come with that word this morning. For some of you like me, you became a Christian when you prayed a prayer. You know, you prayed what we often refer to as the sinner's prayer. You know, I'm bad, Jesus is good, I need Jesus in my life, you know, so that I can be saved. For some of you, you became a Christian when you were baptized. For some of you, you grew up in a tradition that you became a Christian when you completed a set of classes and you were confirmed. And it was at that point that you became a Christian. You know, some of you like me, we grew up believing that our brand of Christianity was like the true brand. You know, I grew up in the Assemblies of God, a very conservative Pentecostal background, and we've kind of felt like we were for sure on the inside track with God because we were holy. You know, we were holier than those Baptist folks. You know, and one of the ways that we knew that we were the real brand was we had church on Sunday nights. Even Wednesday nights. And we even had a system that graded your spirituality by how many times you attended during the week. There were those Sunday morning only Christians, and then there were the faithful ones that came back on Sunday night, and then there were the faithful few that showed up on a Wednesday night, and those were the people that there was no doubt they were getting in because they were the true brand of Christians. And we talk badly about the other brands, you know, those Baptists, those liberal Episcopalians. You know, maybe you grew up Catholic and you thought, yeah, we are the true brand. We are the church. We are the holy Catholic church. We're not sure about all those other folks, but we have been the church since Jesus left the earth. We are the true brand, and we grew up with this idea that our brand was the right brand. Some of you grew up believing that once in, you were always in. You know, once saved, always saved. But some of us grew up believing that once in, not always in. You know, that matter of fact, that it was very easy to be in, but then not be in any longer. You know, and for some of you like me, you know, that maybe you believed, but you didn't believe strong enough, you know, and you were driving home from that not-so-Christian date, you know, and you drove 10 miles an hour under the speed limit because you believed that because you had done some unchristian things, you were no longer in, and if you were to die, you were going to split hell wide open. You know, so you got home and you prayed. You know, as soon as you got in your bedroom, you were on your knees again, God, I'm back, I'm sorry, forgive me. And it was more so because you knew you were going to church the next morning and you didn't want to feel as guilty as what you felt right then, but you wanted to be back in because you were no longer sure you were in. And then some of you are going, no, once you're in, you're always in. And the other crowd is going, no, you're probably not even in because you're not the true brand of Christianity. It's so hard to define. There's so many different expressions. There's so many different emotions this morning that's judged. And for some of you in the room today, if you were really honest, you might even say, I hate Christians. As a matter of fact, you have your own definition, and I've asked the guys to put it on the screen this morning. You believe that Christians are judgmental, homophobic moralists who think that they're the only ones going to heaven and secretly relish the fact that everybody else is going to hell. And in your mind, that's a Christian. But here's the rub this morning. When you look at the Bible, when you look at the New Testament, you look at the book of Acts and the letters written to the church thereafter, none of these things describe Christianity. Nobody became a Christian by being baptized. Nobody became a Christian by completing a class. There was no true brand of Christianity. As a matter of fact, the word Christian is only used 3 times in the Bible. And here's what you need to understand this morning is that every time the word Christian is used, it is used in a derogatory sense, and it is never used of followers of Jesus to describe themselves. The word Christian is exclusively used by those outside the Jesus community to describe those within the Jesus community. That's why the word Christian is so hard to define in our culture, is because the Bible doesn't even define what it means to be a Christian. As a matter of fact, we pick up on one of the 3 times that the word Christian is used really gives some insight into the meaning of the word. We pick up in Acts chapter 11, and what has happened was Jesus has risen from the dead. If you've been in the church very long, you know that Jesus gave one final set of instructions to his followers. Go into all the world and preach the gospel, and they, like us, are oftentimes very slow to respond to what Jesus said, because 7 years later, they were still in Jerusalem, hanging out, having church, having a good time, and then somebody died. I mean, it's always fun and games until somebody dies, a man by the name of Stephen, he preached. A lot of Jews got mad and they stoned him to death with rocks. He didn't get high and die. They killed him with rock by throwing rocks at him. But Stephen got stoned to death, and all of a sudden everybody's like, oh crap, this just got real. So a lot of them ran. I mean, they fled the city, and finally, because of persecution, they finally start obeying what Jesus said, and that was, hey, take this message to the rest of the world. And some of these Christians wound up in a city called Antioch. It's a city in modern day Turkey. And these Jewish believers turned Christians begin to preach the message that, hey, this Jewish rabbi, the Son of God, the Messiah, he died, but then he rose again from the dead, and we witnessed it. God has done a miracle, and Jews and even Gentiles in the city of Antioch begin to respond to the message of Jesus and put their faith in him, and this church began to grow. So when the leaders in Jerusalem caught wind of what was going on in Antioch, they sent one of the bigwigs by the name of Barnabas to the city to find out what was going on. And Barnabas was like, man, this is awesome. I need reinforcements. So he went and picked up Paul, formerly known as Saul. So we pick up this morning in Acts chapter 11, verse 25. Then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, who later became Paul. And when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. And for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. But catch that, they were called Christians not by those inside the Jesus community, but by those on the outside. It was, look at those Christians. It was evident to outsiders that there was this group of people who were connected by their adherence, their loyalty to a person and not just a belief system or a set of behaviors. They identified with this Christ figure, so they referred to them as Christians, ones associated with Christ, but it was a derogatory term. And Christians, those inside the Jesus community, never referred to themselves as Christians. Matter of fact, we have further evidence of this even outside the biblical story. There was a Roman historian by the name of Tacitus who wrote in the late first century and predominantly covered about 4 or 5 different Roman emperors. And one of the emperors that he wrote about extensively was the Roman Emperor Nero. As a matter of fact, most of the information that we have about Nero comes from the historian Tacitus. Well, Nero was a little odd. Some of you that stayed awake through world history classes, you remember that in AD 64, he got a wild hair and burned down Rome. You know, he wanted to remake the city, put his imprint on the city, and what better way to do that than to blow the whole thing up and start over? So he burned the city down. Well, as things go, when you burn things down, usually people don't respond very well. So there was a lot of anger. When your home gets burned down, when your business gets burned up, usually you're not like, oh, that's cool, Nero's gonna rebuild it. No, everybody was mad. So the city was in an uproar, and so Nero, like a true politician, goes into the spin cycle, and he's got to figure out a way to redirect the anger and the blame away from himself. So listen to what Tacitus writes. He says, consequently, to get rid of the report that he had burned the city down, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, and we'll get into that in the coming weeks, called Christians by the populace. They were known by the outsiders as Christians, not what they referred to themselves, but what the outside community referred to them as. And Tacitus continues, he said, Christus, which would be Jesus, from whom the name Christian had its origins, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So for those of you that went to college and your professor told you that there's nothing outside of the Bible that confirms Christianity, they lied, because we have it from respected Roman historians that Jesus existed, that Jesus died at the hands of the Roman government. And one of the things we need to look at here, Tacitus refers to him as Christus. They call them Christians because they thought that was Jesus' name. These are not Jewish believers. These are not Jewish people. The Jews, obviously they believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Well, the Hebrew word that we get Messiah come from, translated into Greek, is the word Christ. So Christ was not Jesus' last name. He was Jesus, the Messiah. But when they would begin to preach this message in the Gentile world, all the Roman and Greek people heard was Jesus Christ. So they thought it was like Brian Ramey. So they thought that Jesus came from Joseph Christ and Mary Christ, and he had a brother by the name of James Christ. They just thought it was his name, and that's why they affixed the name to Christians, that Christians, those associated with essentially Mr. Christ, with Jesus Christ. So some of you didn't know that. Some of you just learned something new in the house of God today. So if you don't get anything else I said today, you're going to be like, I learned something today. That was pretty cool. I probably could have Googled that, but anyway. But the point is this morning that the word Christian was a derogatory term. And some of you are getting uncomfortable because you're thinking, this is what we're known as. This is who we are. But it was a derogatory term only used by outsiders to describe those within the Jesus community. And that's why it's so hard to define. That's why when you ask 10 people, what does it mean to be a Christian? You're likely to get 5, 7, or even 10 different responses, because there's no place we can go to get a clearly defined definition of what it means to be a Christian. We can't even turn to the Bible to find out what it means to be a Christian. And that's why today we have so much bickering even within the Christian community. One brand defines Christianity as this, another brand defines it as that. That's why wars have been committed in the name of Christ, because there's nobody that can say, hey, look to the Bible. You can't do that as a Christian because it's not clearly defined. But as you open the New Testament, you open the Gospels, the story of Jesus, and very specifically the book of Acts, the story of the birth and the expansion of the church, what you don't find is the word Christian, but what you find is a far more terrifying word, a very clearly defined term. a term that those within the Jesus community referred to themselves as, and it was not the word Christian, it was the word disciple. It was the word disciple. And this morning, we can define and redefine and misdefine Christianity all day long. But we cannot misdefine or redefine the word disciple. This morning, the disciple comes from the Greek word mathetos, that means a learner, a pupil, an apprentice, an adherent, or a follower. Someone who has committed themselves to the authority and the teachings of another. Let's go back to Acts chapter 11, verse 26. It says the disciples. This is Luke, an insider, someone who is a part of this Jesus community, writing, taking note of history. And what does he call them? The disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. This morning, a disciple is someone who looks to another and says, I'm trying to make a decision. How would you handle this situation? That's how I'm going to do it. I'm trying to navigate this conflict. What would you do in this situation? That's what I'm going to do. A disciple is one who looks to another in a position of authority and says, how would you handle marriage? How would you handle finances? How would you handle adversity? Then that's how I'm going to handle it. A disciple is one who looks to another and says, I'm looking for wisdom. I'm looking for direction. I'm looking for insight. But before you even respond, my answer to what you say is yes, because I am your disciple. How you live, I'm going to live. How you talk, I'm going to talk. How you handle the different aspects of life is how I'm going to handle the different aspects of life. That's a scary term. We can call ourselves Christians and we can excuse and justify nearly any behavior because we've heard people do it. We've seen other people do it. Well, and they can find a scripture to support their belief. But when you come to the term disciple, there's not a whole lot of wiggle room because we essentially look at the life of Jesus and say, I'm going to live that way. I'm going to love that way. I'm going to treat people that way because I am a disciple. Let's look at a couple other verses this morning. Acts chapter 6, verse 7. So the word of God spread, and the number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests, even preachers. That's how you know revival is happening, when preachers start getting saved. A large number of priests became obedient to the faith. Some of you will get that later. It's okay. Acts chapter 9, verse 26. When he came to Jerusalem, this is talking about Saul, who became Paul. When he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join not the Christians, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him because Paul, before he was Paul, when he was Saul, he tried to kill disciples. He put many in jail. He even handed a number over to be executed. So naturally they were afraid of him, and they did not believe that he was really a disciple. Not really a Christian, but he was really a disciple. So this morning, the real question is not, are we Christians, but are we disciples? Because we can define, redefine, and even misdefine Christian, but we only have one definition of disciple, and that is someone who has committed themselves to the teaching and the life of Jesus Christ. So this morning, in the remainder of our time today, I want to look at one specific application of what it means to be a disciple, something that Jesus himself in his final hours gave his disciples. And if we as the church would have gotten just this one application right, if we would have committed ourselves to just this one thing, not the whole 10 Commandments, not the whole law, not even the entire New Testament, but if we would have committed ourselves to just this one thing, our world, our culture, and the brand of Christianity would be drastically different today. Even in our own country today, if we as Christians would have committed ourselves to this one aspect of being a disciple of Jesus, there would have been no civil war in this country. There would have been no slavery. There would not have been the need for a civil rights movement in the middle part of the last century if we as Christians would have gotten just this one aspect of being disciples of Jesus right. So this morning, let's turn to John chapter 13. To set the stage of where we are today, this is Jesus on his last night on earth. So when you start talking about the weight and the value of last words that someone speaks when they know their time has come, we lean in a little closer. We listen a little bit more clearly. Jesus knows that he's in the closing moments. He knows that Judas has already left the room to go betray him. He knows that he will soon be arrested, that the crucifixion is near. So he seizes this moment to give his disciples one final instruction. In verse 33, it says, "My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come." And at this point, Peter is like, whoa, wait. Where are you going? And more importantly, why can't we go? I mean, we're disciples, we're followers. If you're going somewhere, I'm going. Wait, is this just me? Is Andrew getting to go? Because if Andrew's getting to go, then I'm going too. Peter's like, whoa, no, time out. Before you go any further, where are you going? Because we've been following you for the past 3.5 years, and if you're going somewhere, we're going with you. And Jesus goes on. He says, "A new command I give you." Now, this is interesting. The word translated new here is the Greek word kainos. It means new, unusual, strange, or remarkable. And what is particularly strange about this is that it's not really a new command. Jesus says, "A new command I give you, love one another." Now, the guys in the room are like, that's not new. I mean, even the Old Testament teaches us to love one another. We've heard you say that before. That's not new. But in his final moments, Jesus is given this instruction to his followers. This is who I want you to be. This is what I want you to do. This is what I want you to embody as my disciples, as my followers. Love one another. And what's interesting to note this morning, Jesus is not asking them to feel something. He is asking them to do something. He's not asking them to conjure up an emotion. He is not trying to ask them to manufacture a feeling. He is commanding them to act out of their character, out of his character that is being formed within them. I want you to love one another. I want you to honor and cherish one another. I want you to ascribe so much value to one another that it would never even cross your mind to cause harm to another. I want you to love one another. And just in case they didn't get it, he says, "As I have loved you, so you must love one another." Jesus is probably like, hey, Matthew, you guys remember when we met Matthew? And all the guys were like, yeah, I remember when we met Matthew. Because Matthew was a tax collector. He was a Jew that had become a proxy for the hated Roman government, extorting his own people, collecting taxes that they did not owe from his own people. Tax collectors were hated. And Matthew was like, yeah, I remember. And all the other guys were like, yeah, we remember. You guys remember when we met Matthew? You remember what I said to Matthew? Yeah, we remember. I told Matthew, hey, I want you to come follow me. I want you to join us. You guys remember where we went after Matthew joined our team? Yeah, I remember where we went. We went to Matthew's house, and you guys remember who was there? Yeah, we remember who was there. A bunch of other tax collectors. And we were hanging out with those people that our mama told us to stay away from. And Jesus was like, exactly. In the same way that I loved Matthew, I'm asking you to love one another. You guys remember when we met Nathaniel, one of the 12? Some of you guys may not know, but Nathaniel, Nathanael knows what happened. His brother's here. That when his brother went and told Nathanael, hey, we found the Messiah, and he's from Nazareth. You need to come see. Nathanael said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Nathanael, you dissed my entire family, but I still loved you. I still invited you to follow me. And in the same way that I have loved you, so you must love one another. But then look at verse 35. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. And just in case they didn't get it, if you love one another. They're not going to know you by your brand. They're not going to know you by what kind of concerts you go to. They're not going to know you by what kind of bumper sticker you got on the back of your car. They're not going to know you by the t-shirts that you wear, the movies that you watch. They are going to recognize if you are my disciple if you love one another. And then I love this, verse 36. Simon Peter asked him, Lord, where are you going? Where are you going? It's like Peter didn't get it. It's like Peter wasn't even listening. He's still hung up on Jesus is going somewhere and I'm not getting to go. No, where are you going? All that love stuff, that's great. It's kind of like what we as a church do. All that love stuff, that's good. But like teach us something from Revelation. Like unpack all of the types and the shadows in Leviticus. Like, where are you going? Give us some good stuff. No, Peter. I don't want you to worry about any of that. I want you to love these guys. I want you to love them the same way that I've loved you. And Peter's like, no, I'm going where you're going. And Peter goes on to say, I'm even willing to die for you. And Jesus said, no, Peter, I'm not asking you to die for me. I'm asking you to do something far more difficult than that. I'm asking you to love the same way that I have loved you. Jesus hit on this in another passage. He was asked one time, what's the most important commandment, all the law? Like what the Jewish people considered the Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which I'm sure all of you have read multiple times over. What's the most important commandment in all the law? And Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, mind, and strength, and. Not if you have time, not if you get around to it, not if you feel it, but and love your neighbor the same way you love yourself. And then Jesus throws this kicker in. There is no commandment greater than these. And another passage says, all of the law and the prophets, basically every word of instruction that we as the Jewish people have in our history find their foundation on these 2 commands. Love God, love one another. This morning, what would happen? What would happen within individual churches? What would happen within families if we took this one command to heart, that I'm going to love you the same way that I love myself? In the same way that I want to be valued, I'm going to value you. In the same way that I want to be served, I'm going to serve you. In the same way that I prize my comfort and my convenience, I'm going to serve you to make it as comfortable and convenient for you. In the same way that I want my opinions to be valued and I want my feelings to be honored, I'm going to value yours and honor yours. What would happen within our families, in our marriages, with our children? What would happen if we showed up to work and say, even though I may not even want to be here, and if I had the power, I would fire half of you yahoos, I've still been given a charge by the one I have surrendered my life to, the one that I am a disciple of, and I'm going to love every one of you the same way that I want to be loved. What would happen in our workplaces? What would happen in our churches? What would happen in our community? What would happen in our world if disciples, not Christians, but if disciples of Jesus committed themselves to this one application of what it means to be a disciple and committed themselves to loving one another? That I value you in such a way that I will always seek your best. I will always protect you. I will always honor you. You see, throughout the New Testament, we're given over 60 commands that use the word one another. Love one another is one of them, but so is honor one another, forgive one another, bear with one another, not be a bear to one another, which we are really good at, but put up with one another, overlook offenses, be patient with one another, honor one another, serve one another. And every one of those commands flows out of this charge to love one another. Let me give you something to take home with you today. 1 Corinthians 13, the Apostle Paul writing probably the most vivid, detailed description of what that we have of what it means to love. A charge that is repeated in marriage after marriage after marriage, but has far deeper meaning and a far wider application than just the marriage union, but deals very specifically. If you back up and read 1 Corinthians, the letter that this is in, 1 Corinthians 12 talks about our call to ministry, that we are the body of Christ and every one of us has a responsibility. Chapter 14 deals with leadership and order within the church, and sandwiched in the midst of those is this charge to love. Essentially, Paul is saying that this is important. You have a gift. God has gifted you with spiritual gifts and responsibilities and a call. And we have a mandate as the church to reach this world. But if you're going to be faithful and effective as a disciple, that you've got to embody this command to love. And the Apostle Paul writes this: love is patient. Woohoo! Love is kind. Does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no records of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. This is what I'm going to challenge you to do. This is not new. I've talked about this before. It's what I want you to do every day this week in your personal devotion time. As you read that passage, I want you to substitute your name every time love or it, which is the pronoun referring to the noun. Ooh, how's that for that English breakdown this morning? Every time love or it, which is referencing love, is found, substitute your name in there. And every time you read something that makes you go, stop right there and spend a little time in prayer about that. Because our journey, if we're going to be identified, known as disciples of Jesus by our love, that it is incumbent upon us to become better lovers, to learn to love well. So it would go this way for me. Brian is patient. Well, let's just stop there and pray for a little while. As a matter of fact, we may not get any farther in the scripture this morning, and it may depend on how long I have to spend in prayer that day, because Brian is not patient, but love is. And if I'm going to be recognized as a disciple, it's going to be because I am patient with people, because I am patient with my phenomenal, loving, nearly perfect wife. Is she in the room? I may pay for that. Thank you for the amens. That I am patient with my children. Anybody else struggle with being patient with their children? You liars. Thank you, Scotty. You're my brother. You are my brother. Now some hands start going up, you heathens. We'll preach out of Revelation next week. All liars will have their place in the lake of fire. Regardless of whether you're in or out, you will be out. I struggle with patience. My biggest struggle with my children is that they are impatient. So I usually meet their impatience with a further impatience. And it's like throwing gasoline on a fire of tempers and attitudes and personalities. At least in my home it is. But if I'm going to be known as a disciple, it's going to be because I'm patient. Brian is kind. Do not laugh. Some of you are like, I'm trying to be vulnerable, folks. Do not stab an open wound. It's like that's when you get responsive. It's like no amens, no preach it, brother. But on that moment, we're like, amen. Brian is kind. Brian does not envy. No, Brian does envy. And if I'm going to be known as a disciple, then I've got to be content in who I am and what God has given me. As one of our young ladies in our church taught in one of our women's Bible studies this week, that when we envy, it's like giving the finger to God, that we are not content with what he has given us. I love that. Some of you may get offended by that, but that's like great theology. Brian does not boast. Brian is not proud. Brian does not dishonor others. There are people in the room today that know better than that. Brian is not self-seeking. No, Brian is very, very self-seeking. Brian is not easily angered. That one's pretty true. Brian keeps no record of wrongs. Brian does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. Brian always protects others. You could probably put in there, and that's not true. Brian always trusts. Brian always hopes. Brian always perseveres. Brian never fails. And where I fall short of the test of love is a perfect opportunity for me to learn and grow as a disciple of Jesus Christ. I can slap the label Christian on and just show up to church and not change and not grow. Quite honestly, like people in this room have done for years, like people that we all know, people that we even love do. And they will fight you tooth and nail that they are a Christian. But that's not the question. The question is not, are we Christians? The question is, are we disciples? And as we ponder that answer, let's take the test of love, because by this, they will know that you are my disciples. Let's pray. Father, we love you today.